In November of 1971, Dan D.B. Cooper hijacked a Boeing 727 and jumped out in the middle of night in a rainstorm. So what would the pilots have been thinking? I'll explain it all. Coming up. Hey 7-4 crew, welcome back. If you don't know me, my name's Kelsey. I'm a 747 pilot. My channel 7-4 Gear is all about aviation. Today I'm here on rainy Incheon, South Korea, and this is the view from my hotel room. A while back, someone in the 7-4 crew left a comment asking if I could explain the D.B. Cooper story and what a pilot would have been thinking. If you don't know the story, Dan D.B. Cooper hijacked a Boeing 727 and used ransom to get the equivalent of what today would be about $1 million.
$1 million.
Then got them to take off again and jumped out the back of the plane. He's never been found, and the money's never been found. The fact that he was able to accomplish this, Boeing then changed and modified the Boeing 727 to prevent this from happening in the future, and they named the part after Dan Cooper. Let's get into it. If you aren't familiar with the story, here are the highlights. Cooper was riding on the aircraft, the Boeing 727, and he wrote a note and handed it to the flight attendant. Now, if you don't know this, flight attendants commonly get hit on by a lot of passengers and, probably more than anybody, pilots.
Naughty, naughty.
So she took that note and threw it in her purse. Cooper saw that she didn't even look at the note and she just threw it in her purse. So he said, I think you're going to want to look at that note. On that note, it basically said, I have a bomb. Now that definitely got her attention. So before the aircraft landed in Seattle, Cooper requested $200,000 and 4 parachutes, 2 main and 2 reserve chutes. In exchange for that money and those parachutes and refueling the aircraft, Cooper was going to let everybody on the aircraft go, except for the flight crew and 1 flight attendant. So when the parachutes and the money arrived, they brought them to the aft stair of the aircraft. They loaded them on, and Cooper let everybody go, except the flight attendant and the flight crew, so 2 pilots and 1 flight engineer. If you're unfamiliar with what the stairs look like on the aft part of a 727, this is the picture of it here. Now remember this because it's relevant for the rest of this story. Cooper told the pilots he wanted them to fly at 100 knots, which is about 115 miles an hour. He also told them that he wanted to take off with the stairs down and leave the gear down. Eventually he was convinced that taking off with the stairs down would not be safe, and so they took off with the stairs up, and he decided he would lower those stairs in flight. If I were the pilot at this point, I'd probably be thinking, man, I really should have taken a job flying cargo.
I'm messing with you guys.
I'm just kidding. The reality is I really enjoy actually flying passengers. It's a good mix-up because when you're flying passengers, it's fun, it's different. When you're flying cargo, it's the same thing. So there's goods and bads of both. So at 7:40 at night, the plane took off with the flight crew and the flight attendant, and they took off, and about 8 o'clock, he ordered the flight attendant to go into the flight deck and close the door. From there, he lowered the aft stairs in flight. They left the plane unpressurized, so there would be no difference except just a huge amount of noise and wind that was blowing around inside the aircraft. Because he ordered the pilots to stay at 10,000 feet, the oxygen situation wasn't going to be an issue for the flight crew or the flight attendant or D.B. Cooper. And at 10:15, the flight crew landed, and it's my understanding they landed with the aft stairs down. So that's the general story of D.B. Cooper and what happened. Now, from a pilot's perspective, there are a few considerations and concerns I would have if I were the pilots. First, jets fly at a much higher altitude, usually 30 to 40,000 feet. They're a lot more fuel efficient at that altitude. At 10,000 feet, they're not very fuel efficient. However, they could calculate and figure out what the fuel burn was going to be going from Seattle to Reno at 10,000 feet. They had the technology now to do it with the computer, and probably in the 70s there was some math way to figure it out, which I have no idea how they did it.
Actually, that would not surprise me.
The thing that they would not be able to calculate is the aft stairs being down that entire duration of the flight. Those stairs being down are going to cause a lot of drag. Now, since there was nobody on the plane except for the flight crew, the flight attendant, and Dan Cooper, I'm sure that he probably put a lot of extra gas on the plane, so it was really not a big deal. But having the gear down is a lot of drag, having the stair downs is a lot of drag, and then flying at 10,000 feet is not very fuel efficient. So as a pilot, that would definitely be a concern I would have. Going at that speed, that low for that long, I'd want to make sure, and probably everybody up there, including the flight engineer, were really focused on what that fuel burn was going to be to make sure they could safely land at the airport. Now, when you ordered the flight attendant to go into the flight deck and close the door, at that time in the 70s, there wasn't a peephole like we have now. Now, from the flight deck, we can actually see back, and it's for safety reasons. We can see back there to make sure there's nobody around, and in some cases there's cameras to make sure that we can see that there's nobody around or there's no danger as the pilots are leaving to go to the bathroom. But at this time, there was no peephole. The reality is, I think it would have been pretty cool to be standing at that door and watching Cooper jump out of the back of the plane. Now, let's be honest. If it had happened now, the flight attendant probably would have had her phone up to that peephole and watched Cooper jump out the back and record it on her phone for Instagram. And by flight attendant, I mean me. I would have made the flight attendant sit down and I would have recorded that.
It's funny because it's true.
Since Cooper had told the flight crew that he had a bomb and he had told them not to leave the flight deck, they assumed that he jumped out around 8-something o'clock because there was a shift in the aircraft and they had to retrim the aircraft. But they didn't know for sure exactly what had happened. And the fact that he had a bomb and everything that was going on, they never came out of the flight deck. It's my understanding that at 10:15 when they landed in Reno, they landed with the aft cargo stairs down. Now, my concern would be, again, as a pilot is landing like that, as you can imagine, if you're in a flare, the backside of that plane is going to slam into the ground. So what you'd be trying to do is land as flat as possible, not to preserve the stairs because who really cares, but you're not looking to have something hit the ground first that could cause the safety of the landing to be compromised. I was told by some people that they were able to put the aft cargo stairs up in flight, and I couldn't find any pictures one way or the other to see what had really happened. It's still a mystery today if Cooper survived. Nobody really knows one way or the other. They never found his body. However, because of his success or unknown failure, 15 different people tried it the following year in 1972. All of them were unsuccessful. Also, what happened is they installed something called a Cooper vane. This vane basically allows so that way the door can't be opened in flight, which is what Cooper did. However, that can be disarmed. Had Dan done his research, he would have known that he could have disarmed that vane and he would have been able to still bring the stairs down in flight. But they've added that Cooper vane so that way people couldn't do it on their own without knowing how to disarm that. What's also really interesting to me as a pilot is just how cool he remained and how much knowledge he had of this aircraft. He knew about the flap settings that he wanted, he knew he wanted the gear down, he knew the speed that he wanted, he knew the altitude that he wanted. He had obviously done his research. And from all the reports that I read, he seemed to be very, very calm about the whole thing, which I thought was pretty cool. The heist in general reminded me kind of a cool bad guy version of James Bond. And if you haven't seen the James Bond Hollywood versus Reality on Spectre that I did, I'll put a link to it right here. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.